CO Eugen had spent most of his life learning that being an Omega did not automatically make people care about you. Society loved talking about protecting Omegas, but that protection usually came with conditions. People admired beautiful Omegas, wealthy Omegas, and elegant Omegas. Eugen was none of those things. He was overweight, broke, buried under debt, and constantly treated like someone who took up more space than he deserved. 6 months after losing his father, things had only gotten worse. The hospital bills remained unpaid, rent was overdue, and the lender who had helped cover part of his father's treatment was beginning to lose patience. Eugen worked every job he could find, but no matter how many hours he spent cleaning, carrying supplies, or taking temporary shifts, the money was never enough. That morning, he sat alone in his tiny apartment staring at an eviction notice while trying to figure out how much longer he could survive before everything finally collapsed. Then his phone rang. The call came from Director Han, a woman who managed placements for domestic workers and caretakers. Eugen had applied for dozens of jobs through her agency over the past several months and had been rejected every single time. "I have a position available," she said carefully. "The pay is much higher than normal, housing is included, and they need someone immediately." Eugen sat upright. "I'll take it. You haven't even heard the details." "It doesn't matter." The woman sighed. "Trust me, it matters." Over the next few minutes, she explained the situation. The client was wealthy, powerful, extremely private, and urgently needed a caretaker for his young son. Multiple employees had already quit. Some lasted weeks. Some lasted days. One reportedly lasted less than an afternoon. The child was difficult. The father was even more difficult. Most importantly, the family involved was one nobody wanted to offend. When Eugen heard the name Kang Taehyun, he immediately understood why. Everyone knew who Kang Taehyun was. As the leader of Black Raven, one of the most powerful organizations in the city, he was a man whose influence reached into places ordinary people never saw. People feared him, respected him, and avoided crossing him whenever possible. For Eugen, however, the choice was simple. He needed money. He needed a place to stay. And he had already run out of better options. Several hours later, he found himself standing in front of the enormous gates of the Black Raven estate. The property looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Security cameras monitored every corner. Guards stood watch at every entrance. Even the driveway seemed intimidating. One of the guards checked his information before allowing him inside. The look he received was familiar. Doubt. People always looked at him that way, as if they had already decided he would fail. Eugen ignored it and followed a staff member through the mansion. Everything around him felt expensive, polished, and strangely cold. Despite its size, the house lacked the warmth most homes carried. The silence felt heavy, as though something important had disappeared and never returned. Eventually, he was led into a large study. "The boss will see you shortly," the staff member said before leaving. Eugen remained standing near the door, too nervous to sit. A few moments later, the door opened. Kang Taehyun entered. Eugen immediately understood why people found him intimidating. The alpha carried himself with effortless authority. He didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His presence alone was enough to make a room feel smaller. Dark eyes studied Eugen carefully, taking in the worn clothes, the nervous posture, the signs of a difficult life. Nothing escaped his attention. "You are CO Eugen." "Yes, sir." Taehyun folded his arms. "You understand this position is not a normal caretaker job. I was told your son needs help." A faint shadow crossed the alpha's face. "My son doesn't need help. He needs someone capable of surviving him." The bluntness caught Eugen off guard. Taehyun continued. "My son is 4 years old. Since losing his Omega parent, he has become aggressive, unpredictable, and difficult to control. He attacks staff, destroys property, and drives away every caretaker who enters this house." The alpha's gaze moved over him once again. "With all due respect, you do not look physically capable of handling him." The words stung, not because they were cruel, because they touched an insecurity Eugen had heard his entire life. For a brief moment he considered staying silent. Instead, he lifted his head. Maybe not. But I've spent years doing jobs people said I couldn't handle. I've worked until I could barely stand. I've survived situations that should have broken me. I may not look impressive, but I don't quit easily. The room grew quiet. For the first time, Taehyun seemed mildly surprised. Most people either feared him or desperately tried to impress him. Eugen had done neither. Before either man could continue, a loud crash echoed somewhere down the hallway. The sound was immediately followed by shouting. Then another crash. Then running footsteps. The atmosphere inside the study changed instantly. Taehyun's expression hardened. The door burst open. A small boy appeared in the hallway. His dark eyes burned with anger. His breathing was uneven. One hand tightly gripped a heavy wooden toy. Several staff members chased after him but kept a careful distance. Clearly nobody wanted to get too close. "Young master, please stop running. I said leave me alone." The child ignored everyone. Then his gaze landed on Eugen. The reaction was immediate. Hostility. Pure hostility. Eugen suddenly understood exactly what Director Han had been warning him about. The boy wasn't simply angry. He looked like a child carrying enough grief to drown an adult. "Minwo," Taehyun said firmly. The child didn't even glance at his father. His attention remained fixed on the unfamiliar Omega standing inside the study. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Minwo tightened his grip around the toy. Eugen's heart pounded, but he stayed where he was. Minwo lifted the toy and hurled it straight at him. The wooden toy flew across the room and slammed into Eugen's shoulder, forcing him to take a step back as pain shot through his arm. The study fell silent. None of the staff looked surprised. They had clearly seen this happen before and were already waiting for the newest caretaker to quit. Eugen rubbed his shoulder and looked at the child standing in the hallway. Minwo's eyes burned with anger, but beneath that anger was something harder to ignore. Fear. Loneliness. The kind of pain no child should have to carry alone. "Young master, please calm down," one of the staff members pleaded. "I don't want another Omega here," Minwo shouted back. Another object crashed somewhere nearby. Nobody knew how to stop him anymore. Even Taehyun remained silent, watching with the tired expression of a man who had spent years fighting a battle he couldn't win. Instead of backing away, Eugen slowly knelt down until he was at eye level with the child. The room immediately grew quieter. For the first time, nobody saw an angry alpha facing a caretaker. They saw a grieving child standing in front of someone who seemed to understand that pain. Minwo stared at him suspiciously. "What are you doing?" Eugen rubbed his shoulder and managed a small smile despite the lingering pain. "Trying to figure out whether that throw was aimed at me or if you're secretly training for professional baseball." The reaction was immediate. Confusion. The little alpha blinked twice as though his brain had completely failed to process the answer. "You got hit. I noticed. It hurt. It definitely did." Minwo frowned harder. The conversation wasn't going the way he wanted. Eugen could practically see it happening. The child had prepared himself for another frightened Omega who would either run away or start lecturing him about proper behavior. Instead, he was facing someone who acknowledged the pain without turning it into a tragedy. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Minwo crossed his arms stubbornly and lifted his chin. "You should leave." The words came out sharp, but Eugen noticed something important. The child sounded angry. He did not sound confident. "If that's what you want," Eugen replied gently. Minwo's expression immediately changed. The certainty disappeared. The boy had expected resistance. He had expected bargaining. He had expected someone desperately trying to keep the high-paying job. Instead, Eugen simply accepted the possibility of leaving, and somehow that answer seemed to make the child even more uncomfortable. "You don't care. I care. Then why aren't you arguing?" Eugen considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "Because people don't usually throw things at strangers for no reason." The hallway fell completely silent. Several staff members exchanged looks. Even Taehyun's gaze sharpened slightly. Minwo's small body visibly stiffened. For the first time since entering the mansion, somebody had looked beyond the behavior itself. Yujin continued speaking before the child could interrupt. You're angry, and I think you have every right to be angry. What I don't understand yet is who you're actually angry at. The question hit harder than the wooden toy ever could. Minwo looked away first. Not Yujin. The little alpha suddenly became very interested in staring at the floor. I hate omegas. The statement came so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. Yujin immediately recognized it. This wasn't an opinion. This was armor. People repeated certain beliefs so many times that eventually they started using them as shields. Okay. Minwo looked back at him. Okay. You're allowed to feel that way. The confusion returned immediately. Most adults corrected children. Most adults challenged them. Very few simply listened. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. The child opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Yujin waited patiently. Minwo's eyes began drifting toward a framed photograph sitting on a nearby table. The movement was brief, almost unconscious, but Yujin noticed. Inside the frame was a smiling Omega standing beside a younger Taehyun, while holding a much smaller version of Minwo in his arms. Everything suddenly made sense. The story's director Han mentioned. The missing mother. The grief. The hatred toward every caretaker who entered the house afterward. Minwo wasn't angry because he hated Omegas. Minwo was angry because he loved one Omega too much and lost him. The realization made Yujin's chest ache. My dad died a few months ago, he said quietly. The confession surprised everyone, including himself. Minwo slowly looked up. Yujin continued speaking. For a while I thought being angry was easier than being sad. Every time someone told me to move on, I wanted to yell at them. Every time someone acted normal, I wanted to break something. The child's expression changed slightly. Just slightly. But it changed. Did it work? Minwo asked. No. The answer came immediately. Being angry all the time is exhausting. The little alpha lowered his gaze. For the first time, the tension around him seemed to weaken. Not disappear. Just weaken. Yujin leaned forward slightly. You miss him, don't you? Nobody needed clarification. Minwo knew exactly who Yujin meant. The child's eyes immediately became glassy. He looked furious about it. Furious that he was sad. Furious that somebody had noticed. Furious that he suddenly felt seen. Several long seconds passed before he finally whispered something so quietly that almost nobody else heard it. He left. The words broke Yujin's heart. Because that was how children understood death. Not gone forever. Not passed away. Just left. No, Yujin said softly. I don't think he wanted to. Minwo looked at him. The boy's lower lip trembled. Just once. Then he immediately tried to hide it. Yujin didn't point it out. Didn't push. Didn't force anything. He simply stayed where he was and let the silence breathe. For the first time all afternoon, nobody in the hallway seemed afraid. Not because Minwo had changed, but because somebody had finally reached him. The little alpha stood completely still before slowly taking one step forward. Then another. Then another. By the time he stopped moving, he was standing directly in front of Yujin. Nobody dared interrupt. Nobody dared move. Minwo stared at him for several seconds before reaching out and grabbing the front of his shirt. Not aggressively. Not violently. Just tightly. Like somebody afraid of being left behind. His voice was barely above a whisper. You really won't yell at me? Yujin smiled. No. The child's grip tightened. You won't leave today? There it was. The real fear. Not hatred. Not anger. Abandonment. Yujin looked into the boy's eyes and answered with complete honesty. Not today. Something fragile cracked inside Minwo at that moment. The hostility that had greeted Yujin since the moment he entered the mansion suddenly felt smaller, weaker, as though it had never been hatred at all. The little alpha continued holding onto Yujin's shirt while refusing to let go. and nobody in the Black Raven household could remember the last time they had seen him willingly seek comfort from someone. Across the hallway, Kang Taehyun watched the entire scene unfold in complete silence. He had hired specialists, therapists, caretakers, and experts from every corner of the country. None of them had managed to achieve what this unemployed Omega had accomplished in less than an hour. For the first time in a very long time, Minwo looked less like a child at war with the world and more like a child who simply wanted someone to stay. And as Yujin remained kneeling there while the boy held tightly onto his shirt, Taehyun found himself staring at the Omega far longer than necessary. Maybe Director Han hadn't sent the wrong caretaker after all. Maybe she had sent the first one who actually saw the child beneath the anger. And neither of them noticed that the head housekeeper standing at the end of the hallway was watching the scene with a dark expression. His eyes lingering on Yujin with obvious displeasure before he quietly turned away and disappeared down the corridor. The atmosphere inside Black Raven changed in a way nobody expected after that day. It was not a dramatic transformation, nor was it some miraculous overnight cure for the grief that had settled over the mansion since the death of Minwo's Omega parent. The child was still difficult. He still refused to listen to most people. He still threw tantrums and occasionally broke things whenever his emotions became too overwhelming. Yet for the first time in a very long while, there was someone he willingly allowed to remain close. That someone was Seo Yujin. Over the next several days, the staff watched with growing disbelief as the young alpha repeatedly sought out the Omega's presence. If Yujin was in the kitchen helping prepare breakfast, Minwo would find an excuse to appear there. If Yujin was organizing toys in the playroom, Minwo would quietly sit nearby pretending not to pay attention. The little alpha never openly admitted he liked the Omega, and he certainly never acted affectionate in front of others, but everyone noticed the difference. Most importantly, the screaming became less frequent. The destruction became less frequent. Even the nightmares seemed slightly less severe. Kang Taehyun noticed all of it. He noticed how his son finished meals more often whenever Yujin sat beside him. He noticed how Minwo no longer locked himself inside his room for hours after emotional outbursts. He noticed how the mansion itself felt strangely different whenever he returned home after long meetings. The house still carried grief, but it no longer felt empty. That realization should have been comforting. Instead, it made him uneasy, because the more important Yujin became to Minwo, the more dangerous it would be if the Omega eventually left. Unfortunately, not everyone inside Black Raven shared Minwo's growing attachment. The person most displeased by Yujin's presence was head housekeeper Choi. Choi had served the Black Raven family for nearly 20 years. He had watched Taehyun build the organization from nothing. He had watched Minwo grow up. In his mind, loyalty and discipline were everything. Yujin represented neither. As far as Choi was concerned, the Omega was an outsider who had arrived from nowhere and somehow gained the young master's trust within days. He didn't like it. Not at all. The first signs were subtle. Orders mysteriously failed to reach Yujin. Meal schedules were changed without informing him. Important supplies disappeared. Whenever mistakes happened, Choi somehow found a way to make them Yujin's responsibility. Yujin noticed the pattern quickly, but years of working difficult jobs had taught him to endure far worse. Compared to debt collectors and public humiliation, passive-aggressive workplace hostility barely registered as a threat. He simply kept doing his job. Unfortunately, Choi wasn't satisfied. One afternoon, while Yujin was helping Minwo assemble a complicated model set in the playroom, one of the maids rushed into the room looking visibly panicked. "Young master, the imported crystal display in the west hallway is broken." Several staff members immediately gathered. Voices filled the corridor. The expensive display case had shattered across the marble floor, leaving fragments of glass scattered everywhere. Choi arrived moments later. His gaze immediately landed on Yujin. "Where were you 20 minutes ago?" Yujin frowned slightly. "Preparing Minwo's lunch." Several staff members exchanged looks. Choi folded his arms. "That's strange because multiple employees saw you walking through this hallway shortly before the display was destroyed." Yujin blinked. "That's impossible. Are you calling them liars?" The accusation came so quickly that even Eugen felt caught off guard. Before he could answer, Choi continued. Since your arrival, accidents have become increasingly common. Expensive equipment is damaged. Staff are distracted. Rules are ignored. Perhaps we have been too generous. The implication was obvious. The room grew uncomfortable. Eugen knew exactly what was happening. Someone wanted him gone. The problem was that he had no evidence. Before he could defend himself, a small voice suddenly interrupted. It wasn't him. Everyone turned. Minwo stood near the doorway. For a brief second, Choi's expression tightened. The housekeeper forced a polite smile. Young master, this matter doesn't concern you. You're wrong. Minwo walked forward. His gaze never left Choi. It wasn't him. The room fell silent. Eugen stared at the child in surprise. This was the first time Minwo had openly defended him. Unfortunately, Choi was not willing to back down. The young master is mistaken. I'm not. Then perhaps you misunderstood what happened. Minwo's jaw tightened. The atmosphere instantly became tense. Eugen immediately stepped in before things escalated further. Enough. Both of them looked at him. The display can be replaced. Arguing won't solve anything. Choi looked annoyed. Minwo looked frustrated. But the confrontation ended there. At least on the surface. Later that evening, however, things became much worse. The entire household gathered for dinner as usual. Taehyun had returned earlier than expected, and was quietly reviewing documents while Minwo sat nearby. The meal proceeded normally until one of the servants suddenly rushed into the dining room looking horrified. Boss! Everyone looked up. The servant was pale. The young master has been injured. The room instantly froze. Taehyun stood. What happened? The servant swallowed nervously. The playroom ladder collapsed. Several chairs scraped backward. Within seconds, everyone rushed toward the playroom. When they arrived, Minwo was already sitting on the floor with a minor cut on his arm. It wasn't serious, but blood was still visible. Eugen immediately moved toward him. Are you okay? The little alpha nodded. Before anyone could say another word, Choi spoke. The ladder was inspected yesterday. The implication was immediate. Silence spread through the room. Choi looked directly at Eugen. The only person who used it today was him. Eugen felt his stomach drop. For the first time since arriving at Black Raven, even some of the staff looked uncertain. The situation looked bad. Very bad. Taehyun's expression darkened. His gaze shifted toward Eugen. The disappointment wasn't obvious. But it was there. And somehow that hurt more than outright anger. Eugen opened his mouth. Then closed it again. Because he realized something. Nobody would believe him. Not without proof. Not against someone who had served the family for decades. The room suddenly felt much colder. Minwo looked back and forth between the adults. Confusion filled his face. The child clearly didn't understand why everyone was staring at Eugen. But the adults did. An invisible line had appeared. And Eugen was standing alone on one side of it. That night, long after the mansion had gone quiet, Eugen sat alone inside his room staring at his packed suitcase. The familiar feeling of defeat slowly settled over him. Maybe this had been inevitable. Maybe people like him were never meant to belong in places like Black Raven. For a while, he simply sat there listening to the silence. Then he quietly began folding his clothes. If staying meant causing more problems for Minwo, then leaving was probably the right thing to do. Outside the room, hidden in the darkness of the corridor, a small figure stood completely still. Minwo had seen the suitcase. He had seen the packed clothes. And for the first time since losing his Omega parent, genuine fear returned to his eyes. Because the one person who promised not to leave today suddenly looked like he was preparing to disappear forever. Eugen barely slept that night. After packing most of his belongings into the old suitcase he had brought with him, he remained sitting on the edge of the bed for hours, staring at the floor while countless thoughts raced through his mind. Part of him wanted to stay. The truth was that despite arriving only a short time ago, Black Raven had already started feeling different from every other place he had worked. For the first time in years, somebody had needed him for more than labor. For the first time in years, a child had looked at him not with judgment, but with trust. Yet another part of him understood how dangerous that attachment could become. Minwo had already been hurt once. If people continued blaming Yujin for every accident inside the mansion, eventually that trust would turn into another source of pain. By sunrise, Yujin had convinced himself that leaving was the responsible choice. The decision felt terrible, which was exactly why he believed it was probably the right one. After quietly finishing breakfast alone, he spent the morning organizing the last few things in his room while avoiding unnecessary contact with the rest of the household. Most staff members noticed something was wrong, but nobody said anything. Rumors had already spread throughout the mansion regarding the broken display and the playroom accident. Some people believed Yujin had simply been unlucky. Others were less generous. Either way, the atmosphere felt uncomfortable enough that everyone seemed relieved to avoid discussing it. The only person who hadn't received the message was Minwo. The little alpha spent nearly an hour searching the mansion before finally arriving outside Yujin's room. He knocked once, received no answer, then pushed the door open himself. What he saw immediately made his stomach drop. The suitcase was sitting beside the bed. Half the shelves were empty. Several drawers stood open. For a few seconds he simply stared. Then he looked at Yujin. "What's that?" Yujin's hands froze. The question sounded simple, but the fear behind it was unmistakable. He slowly set down the shirt he had been folding. "I'm organizing some things." Minwo wasn't fooled. The child walked directly toward the suitcase. His eyes moved across the packed clothes, the travel bag, the empty shelves. The silence stretched between them. Then came the question Yujin had been dreading. "Are you leaving?" The Omega felt a painful knot tighten in his chest. There were moments when lying would have been easier. This wasn't one of them. "I think it might be better." The answer hit the child like a physical blow. For a moment Minwo simply stood there. Then his expression changed. Not into anger, into panic. The kind of panic children experienced when their worst fear suddenly became real. "No." Yujin forced a small smile. "Minwo, no." The response came louder this time. The child stepped backward. His breathing became uneven. Yujin immediately recognized what was happening. This wasn't a tantrum. This wasn't defiance. This was fear. Raw and overwhelming. "You said you wouldn't leave." The accusation broke something inside Yujin. "I said I wouldn't leave that day. You promised." Minwo's voice trembled. Yujin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because from the perspective of a child who had already lost someone important, there was no meaningful difference between tomorrow and forever. The little alpha suddenly grabbed the front of Yujin's shirt, just like he had during their first meeting. Only this time the grip was desperate. "Don't go." The words came out almost as a plea. Yujin looked away. If he kept staring at the child, he knew he would lose the strength to leave. "Minwo, don't go." The second plea sounded even smaller. Then the fear finally overwhelmed him. The child burst into tears. Not quiet tears. Not controlled tears. The kind that came from a wound that had never healed properly. His entire body shook as months of grief, loneliness, fear, and abandonment spilled out all at once. He clung desperately to Yujin's shirt while crying so hard that he could barely breathe between words. The sound echoed through the hallway. Staff members immediately rushed toward the room. Several froze at the doorway. Nobody had seen Minwo break down like this in a very long time. One maid covered her mouth. Another looked close to tears herself. Then another figure appeared behind them. Kang Taehyun. The alpha stopped the moment he entered the room. His eyes immediately found his son. And for the first time in a long while he looked genuinely shaken. Minwo wasn't throwing things. He wasn't screaming in anger. He wasn't acting out. He was simply terrified. Terrified that somebody important was leaving him again. The realization hit Taehyun harder than he expected. For months he had focused on controlling the behavior, the tantrums, the destruction, the aggression. He had been so busy fighting the symptoms that he sometimes forgot what existed underneath them. Grief. The child was still grieving, and somehow Eugen had become important enough that losing him felt like losing family. Taehyun's gaze shifted toward the packed suitcase, then toward Eugen. Everything suddenly became clear. Before anyone else could speak, Minwo's tearful voice filled the room again. Don't let him go. The child wasn't speaking to Eugen anymore. He was speaking to his father. The room fell completely silent. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Taehyun slowly stepped forward. His expression remained calm, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something thoughtful. Something determined. Who told you to pack your things? He asked quietly. Eugen hesitated. No one. Then why are you leaving? The Omega lowered his gaze. Because I'm causing problems. Taehyun looked at him for a moment. Then he glanced toward the doorway where housekeeper Choi was standing. The older man's face immediately stiffened. For the first time since the accidents began, something about the entire situation suddenly felt wrong. Very wrong. Taehyun had spent years building Black Raven. He trusted evidence, patterns, facts, and the pattern surrounding Eugen was beginning to look less like incompetence and more like sabotage. His expression darkened. Nobody is leaving. The statement immediately drew every eye in the room, including Choi's. Taehyun's voice remained calm, but it carried absolute authority. I'll investigate everything myself. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Eugen looked up. Minwo stopped crying just long enough to stare at his father. Meanwhile, at the doorway, housekeeper Choi's face became noticeably paler. Because for the first time since Eugen arrived at Black Raven, the Alpha King himself was finally paying attention. And deep down, Choi knew exactly what that meant. The atmosphere inside Black Raven changed dramatically after Kang Taehyun personally announced he would investigate the recent incidents himself. Nobody questioned the order. Nobody dared. For years, the Alpha had built his reputation on seeing through lies and identifying threats long before they became dangerous. If he decided to look into something personally, the outcome was rarely favorable for the person hiding the truth. Within 2 days, the investigation uncovered what Eugen had suspected all along. The broken display case had not been damaged by him. The maintenance records for the playroom ladder had been altered. Several employees admitted they had been pressured into giving misleading statements. Most importantly, evidence pointed directly toward housekeeper Choi. The revelation shocked many members of the household. Choi had served the family for years. Nobody expected him to deliberately target a caretaker. When confronted, the older man did not deny what he had done. Instead, he admitted that he had wanted Eugen gone from the beginning. I thought I was protecting the family, he said during the private meeting. Taehyun's expression remained unreadable. By framing an innocent person? He was changing things too quickly. The answer only made the room colder. Choi explained that after the death of Minwo's Omega parent, Black Raven had become stable in its own broken way. The household understood the rules. They understood the pain. Then Eugen arrived and disrupted everything. Minwo listened to him, trusted him, relied on him, and Choi feared what would happen if that trust was taken away later. Ironically, in trying to prevent future heartbreak, he had nearly created exactly what he feared. The decision came quickly. Choi was dismissed from his position, not because he hated Eugen, but because he betrayed the trust placed in him. The news spread through the mansion before sunset. For the first time since arriving at Black Raven, Eugen felt the weight pressing on his chest begin to lift. More importantly, Minwo smiled. It wasn't a large smile. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there, and somehow that felt more valuable than anything else. Life slowly returned to normal over the following week. Eugen unpacked his suitcase. The staff became noticeably friendlier. Minwo practically followed him everywhere. Even Taehyun seemed less distant than before. The Alpha still spent most of his days managing Black Raven affairs, but whenever he returned home, he often found himself unconsciously searching for familiar voices. The sound of Minwo laughing, the sound of Yujin talking, the strange warmth that had gradually started filling rooms that once felt empty. He refused to think too deeply about why he noticed those things. Unfortunately, peace inside Black Raven never lasted very long. The trouble began late one evening. A violent storm rolled across the city, covering the mansion grounds in rain and darkness. Most of the household had already retired for the night when security suddenly reported something unusual. Minwo was missing. At first nobody panicked. The child occasionally hid whenever he was upset. The staff assumed he had locked himself in one of the unused rooms again. Then 10 minutes passed. 20. 30. No sign of him. The atmosphere quickly changed. Security teams spread throughout the property. The mansion entered lockdown. Every room was searched. Every corridor checked. The rain outside continued growing heavier. Yujin felt dread settle into his stomach. He had never seen the staff look this frightened before. Even Taehyun's composure began showing cracks. The alpha remained outwardly calm, but everyone could sense the tension radiating from him. Because this wasn't just any child. This was his son. And after everything that had happened years ago, losing him again was not something Taehyun could survive. An hour passed. Then another. The search expanded across the estate. Still nothing. Finally, while checking an older section of the property rarely used by the household, Yujin noticed something strange. A small light, barely visible, hidden behind a storage building near the far end of the garden. Ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes, he immediately ran toward it. The old structure had once been used as a greenhouse years ago before being abandoned. Most people never visited it anymore. When Yujin pushed open the door, his heart nearly stopped. Minwo was sitting alone inside, curled up in a corner, holding a flashlight. The child's eyes widened when he saw Yujin. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Yujin rushed forward. "Do you have any idea how worried everyone is?" Minwo immediately looked guilty. "I wasn't trying to run away." "Then what are you doing here?" The child lowered his head. For several seconds only the sound of rain filled the room. Then he finally answered. "Today was the anniversary." Yujin froze. He didn't need clarification. The anniversary of the bombing. The anniversary of losing his Omega parent. Everything suddenly made sense. The hiding. The sadness. The silence. The child wasn't being rebellious. He was grieving. Again. Yujin slowly sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Eventually Minwo leaned slightly closer. Not enough to look needy. Just enough to feel less alone. And Yujin stayed. When security finally arrived with Taehyun minutes later, the relief on everyone's faces was immediate. Especially Taehyun's. The alpha stopped the moment he saw his son safe. For a brief second, all the fear he had been hiding became visible. Then it disappeared behind composure once more. The ride back to the mansion was quiet. The crisis was over. Minwo was safe. Everything should have ended there. But fate had other plans. Later that night, after Minwo finally fell asleep, Yujin found himself standing alone on a balcony overlooking the rain-soaked grounds. He didn't hear Taehyun approach until the alpha stopped beside him. For several moments neither spoke. Then Taehyun finally broke the silence. "Thank you." Yujin blinked. "What for?" "For finding him." The sincerity in the alpha's voice caught him off guard. Taehyun rarely showed vulnerability. Yet tonight felt different. "He trusts you," Taehyun continued quietly. "More than anyone." Yujin looked away. "I think he's just lonely." "So am I." The words slipped out before Taehyun could stop them. Both men froze. The silence that followed felt strangely intimate. Their eyes met. For a brief moment neither looked away. The distance between them suddenly felt much smaller than it should have. Too small. Dangerously small. And for the first time, Yujin became aware of something he had been trying very hard not to notice. The man standing beside him wasn't just Minwo's father. He wasn't just the terrifying Alpha King of Black Raven. He was a lonely man carrying grief just as heavily as his son. The realization made Eugen's heart beat faster. Then a phone suddenly rang. The moment shattered instantly. Taehyun answered. His expression changed within seconds. The warmth vanished. Something colder took its place. Say that again. Eugen immediately knew something was wrong. The alpha ended the call and turned toward him. A few minutes later, they were sitting inside Taehyun's private office while several trusted security officers stood nearby. One of them placed an old evidence file on the desk. Inside was newly recovered footage connected to the bombing that killed Minwo's Omega parent years ago. The video quality was poor, the image shaky, but the scene was unmistakable. Smoke, fire, chaos, people running, and then a figure appeared on screen. Someone carrying a small child away from the explosion. The footage zoomed in. The room fell silent. Eugen stared. Taehyun stared. Nobody spoke. Because the person carrying Minwo out of the burning wreckage was unmistakably Co Eugen. Before anyone could process the shock, another officer stepped forward and placed a photograph beside the monitor. A recent photograph. Picture of Eugen. Underneath it were two chilling words. Target found. The room instantly became cold. Because somewhere out there, someone had finally discovered that Co Eugen was still alive. Thanks for listening to part 1 of this story. Just when Eugen finally found a place where he felt accepted, everything changed in a single moment. The child he helped heal turns out to be connected to his own forgotten past. And the mysterious footage raises a terrifying question that nobody inside Black Raven can answer. Why was Eugen at the bombing scene years ago, and who has been searching for him all this time? In the next part, long-buried secrets begin to surface. New enemies step out of the shadows, and the bond between Eugen, Minwo, and Taehyun will be tested in ways none of them expect. The story is only getting started, and some of the biggest twists have not been revealed yet. If you want to continue immediately and watch the remaining parts without waiting, you can find the full story on Patreon through the link in the description below. Thank you so much for your support, and I'll see you in the next part.